In Conversation with JP Pomare was recorded live at the 2025 Spada Conference.
Very lucky this morning to be able to have a conversation with JP Pomare, who is flown in from Melbourne, I believe, right from Aotearoa. And to lead the conversation, I'd like you to make welcome Paula Browning.
Moreno, koutou, ko Paula Browning, tōku ingoa, nā mā haere mai. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about taking IP ownership from one part of the creative system, the book publishing world, into another part, the screen industry. Award-winning author JP Pomare, welcome. Happily, I do know a little bit about IP and publishing and am an avid crime reader of all of Josh's novels. Now, I'm not saying that just because I'm sitting up here with him. I literally have read everything he wrote. And now, having researched what we're going to talk about today, I know his next book's coming out in February and I've pre-ordered it. So hopefully I'm not going to embarrass either of us this morning. And we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end, so keep thinking about those questions you might like to ask. So a little bit of background on the gentleman to my right. His first novel, Call Me Evie, won the Ngā Marsh Award for Best First Novel. Now, if there are any non-bookie types in the room, please leave now. Otherwise, you might know that the Ngāos are New Zealand's mystery, thriller, crime and suspense awards run by the phenomenal Craig Sisterson. Originally from Kaharoa, near Rotorua, JP has lived across the ditch in Melbourne for a while now, and in what can only be described as making it look easy, he's written a book a year from 2018 to 2022, which suggests he spends a lot of time thinking about crime and murder. From 2023 to 2025, he published original work in multiple formats, with new print and ebooks being joined by original audiobook titles. This is not at all typical in the New Zealand publishing industry. His 2019 novel In the Clearing was adapted as an 8-part miniseries by Disney+, and The Last Guests from 2021 has been made into a Stan original TV series called Watching You, which premiered in October this year. His 2024 novel 17 Years Later is currently being adapted for the screen, and his latest work, The Gambler, as I said, is due out in February. In addition to the ANZ market, his books have been published in the UK and the US and translated into German and French. Tell Me Lies from 2020 was a #1 Audible bestseller, that's an audiobook platform, and was shortlisted for the Ngā Marsh Award for Best Novel and the Ned Kelly Award for Best Crime Fiction. JP has also received and been shortlisted for a number of other prizes, including the KYD Unpublished Manuscript Prize, Alan Kemp Memorial Prize, and the Kingi McKinnon Scholarship. It just goes on. His work has appeared in numerous journals and publications, including Kill Your Darlings, the Mascara Literary Review, the New Zealand Listener, the Lifted Brow, the Spin-Off, and Takahe. And in 2020, JP was a recipient of the Māori Writers Residency at the Michael King Writers Centre. That is a whirlwind 7 years. Did I miss anything important?
No, that's pretty comprehensive, actually.
I can do my research. That's one thing you do learn in the publishing industry. So there was a time before 2018 when your first book came out that you were building your writing career. What and who shaped the writer you are today?
Yeah, I think it's. I always wanted to write, but I think I wanted to be a journalist actually because you grow up basically in a farming community and there's no role models really in that space for writing novels. In fact, everyone tells you can't make money or there's no career in it. And I lost count of the number of times I was told that as a kid. My journalism teacher, of all people, said it's a hard slog and you won't make any money. So he sort of pushed me more towards journalism. And in fact, I think journalism now is probably tougher actually, and it's getting tougher every year. There's a real hostility towards people who studied journalism, at least, So I'm relieved that I went down the path I did, but it probably wasn't until I was in my 20s that I really thought there's a career here. I think the people that most kind of influenced me were, at the time, I'd read, I was reading a lot of sort of Steinbeck and Bukowski and all the stuff you kind of, a slightly insolent early 20s male would read. But I went on to read a lot of stuff like Helen Garner, who's really big in Australia. I think she's probably reasonably well known here. And I was reading, a lot more kind of contemporary fiction by people around my age who I thought were really impressive, lots of short stories and stuff like that. And I had this idea that it's as a kind of, it's more of a sort of, I guess, an academic approach or a methodical approach. I sort of thought, I was reading stuff I'd written 5 years ago and I was going, this is horrible, this is horrendous. But at the time I thought it was pretty good. Maybe that's happening right now. Maybe in 5 years I'll look back at where I am now and think this stuff is terrible. What was I thinking? And so I realised quite quickly, without any sort of outside validation or any industry expertise, I wouldn't know where I'm at until someone else came in and told me. So I really wrote a lot of short stories and just sent them out far and wide, waiting till the kind of, the void responded, basically. And, I recall my very first rejection letter, and I say this with sincerity and honesty, the first rejection letter I got that was personalised was more exciting for me than the first publishing contract. And the reason being is that was a combination of probably a decade almost, at least 7 or 8 years of just spamming out my terrible short fiction, trying to get better all the time, studying the craft, reading what I should read, working hard. That was someone finally acknowledging that I exist as a writer and to keep going. And then the first time I had a short story published in a major publication in Australia, I was on my honeymoon and it was the happiest moment of my life. I'm still married, impossibly somehow. But we were away, and I just got this email, and I just really lost it because finally something was happening, and that's sort of when I gave myself permission to write the novels and to start working on something longer.
So was that the publisher that you're still with now? Because you've been with the same publisher for your entire career.
Yeah. So I've jumped around a little bit in other territories. In the UK and US and France, Germany and Korea and stuff. I've had different publishers all around the world, but in Australia and New Zealand, I've had the same publisher the whole way through. I think something people don't tend to realise outside of the industry is it's not like a lotto ticket and you win the lotto when you get published, because it's a sort of, often you have an agent first, or often you've had contact with a publisher, and so you sort of work towards it, and it's not as sudden. For some people perhaps it is, but certainly from my experience and most people I know in the industry, it's a kind of culmination of things. You have an agent, the agent's pretty confident it's going to get published, and she'll my agent told me that. And then you start to get deals, and I got a deal in Australia and then overseas and stuff. So it sort of all happens in a quite predictable way actually by that stage. And so, yeah, I am with my original publisher in Australia, but I landed with a Big Five publisher and they've treated me pretty well, so I've stayed with them. Yeah.
I think that's, in terms of the context of the creative industries here, the mix of the overseas organisations and the local and how they work together to build a whole ecosystem, that's a bit people often don't understand. You need the pillars of the multinationals along with the independents, and certainly Hachette New Zealand is a stalwart in the local publishing industry. How does your connection with iwi, your Ngā Puhi, how does that connect with your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I've lived outside of New Zealand now as long as I lived in New Zealand, and I realised that, and it dawned on me. Although I come back 2 or 3 times every year, possibly more actually, I still feel slightly adrift sometimes. I grew up in a farming community. I was at a school where we were the Māori kids. There's 150 kids at the school, and they're all dairy farmers. kids, and then I went from there. I don't know if anyone knows schools in the area, but I went from there to Kaitau, which is intermediate school, which is, I think, like 1,500 kids between the age of 11 and 13, and it was like there were men there, you know, suddenly. And then I went from there to Western Heights, which is proudly and predominantly a Māori school. There's lots of Māori kids there, and suddenly I was in the majority. And so I've had this real, I've had this kind of slightly awkward realization that I've always been somewhere in the middle somehow, you know, I think, and being in Australia, it's a lot harder to connect with Te Ao Māori and with the iwi. And so I do think it informs my work, and I don't force it, but certainly recognising just recognising class and race issues in Australia, particularly in my last novel, 17 Years Later, and writing more towards that. My first novel's set in Makatu, and it's about a young Australian girl interacting with the environment of Makatu, but in particular lots of the locals. And so there's a lot of stuff, it's a lot of coming together, and I'm fascinated by the way in which, you know, the way in which the culture in New Zealand has changed and continues to change over the years, and what's still left to be done. And I think 17 Years Later hopefully demonstrates where I'm at with all that stuff.
Yeah, there was a nice, the way that story was told, the looking back and the going back. Yeah, that was the beautiful way of looking at how far we have come.
It's funny, you know, it's funny because it's 17, I wrote it 2 years ago, and by that stage I hadn't lived in New Zealand for 17 years, basically. And so I was writing the stuff that was happening 17 years later. It's all memory, and I felt like I had it pretty close. It's set in Cambridge. My dad's a horse trainer, so I spent a lot of time in that town, and I know it really well. Lots of my friends are from there, and so I felt like I had a lot of confidence in writing that stuff in 2006 or whenever it was set. But then there's a narrative thread that's contemporary. It's set right now, or was set in 2024. And so for that stuff, I really struggled. And I remember I came back. I said to my wife, I was at late stages in the edits, and it wasn't working. The setting just wasn't quite clicking for me. So I said to her, I've got to go back to New Zealand. And she goes, when? I said, well, edit's due next week. I think I've got to go tomorrow. And we've got a kid, so there's lots to figure out. But basically, I got on a plane the next day. I booked a rental car. I flew over. I drove down, and my character stays in the worst motel in New Zealand, so I had to find the worst motel in New Zealand, and it happens to be in Cambridge. And so people asked, how did you find the worst motel in New Zealand? I went to TripAdvisor, I sorted by rating, I scrolled to the bottom, and it was, it did what it said on the packet, basically.
So you look for a motel with the concrete block walls on the inside, and the pink and green curtains,
horrible,
and the bedspread things.
Hopefully no one owns this joint here, but it's called the #1 Motel, Cambridge. And I thought, oh, maybe that's the best motel in Cambridge, but it's #1 as in NO1. No one should ever stay at this place. But I came back, and I discovered lots of things about the place, and the sprawl of kind of these suburbs and McMansions that have taken over lots of the farmland. But I also had forgotten how dense, how thick the Waikato fog is at that time of year. It was sensational. I went out for a walk at like 1 a.m. And you almost have to resist the urge to pull yourself through it. You know, it was just so thick. And in the middle of Cambridge, which I did, again, something I'd forgot, or perhaps it wasn't there when I was younger, there's this big glowing cross, and it's in the fog, and so you think you've died, and you know you're at the field, because you're like, that is so spooky. It's almost designed, you know, to cause some sort of fear, or you know, like and I walked through the park. There's this park, which it's just the perfect setting for kind of like a horror, which is not what I was writing, but it was the most important thing to do, and it was just about connecting back with that sense of place.
So, sense of place, and obviously the other main thing in a good story is the characters, and a lot of yours carry deep trauma. that goes into, you go into childhood abuse, cult indoctrination, and violation of privacy. How much of creating that amount of psychological depth takes a personal toll?
Yeah, I will just say those are across a number of works. Those aren't all the same one, you know. Yeah. I think one thing I would also say is I have certainly changed from some of my early stuff. I feel like there's one book I couldn't write as a parent. And I remember lots of people reading this and saying, I was loving it, but I just had to stop. It was too much. And I was like, what are you talking about? But now I get it. And so I think maybe I've softened up now that I'm a dad, or I don't know. But I think I've definitely changed where I will go and where I won't go. And it continues to change. And I remember someone else also pointing out all the kind of bad guys, which I don't subscribe to, but all the murderers or whatever are a woman in your book. And it was almost like a psychological thing where I was so scared of perpetuating, like, you know, things about violence against women and using that as a kind of, you know, as... Well, it's most of my readers are women, and it's the same thing with true crime. I think I'd be tapping into something there if I were to make the victims women. And so I think, although it wasn't conscious, I think there was some sort of psychological barrier to writing that. I was just thinking, it can't be the male, not again, you know. And so there's lots of stuff I'm unpacking about myself, I think, as I write as well, and I'm trying to think more deeply about. But then again, most of it, I think, is just purely from the ether. It's just subconscious. What kind of terrifies me the most? When you talk about surveillance, there's a book I wrote called The Last Guest, which is basically about, it's about cameras installed in Airbnbs for a network of voyeurs. And of course, the moment I write it, news stories come out about people who are doing this. But for me, it was born out of this idea. We Airbnb'd our place. We had an apartment, and we just put it on Airbnb to see what would happen, which is a hopelessly naive thing to do, to be honest. But we just thought, if someone books it, we'll go away. And someone booked it, and then the money they paid us, we spent to go away ourselves. And we thought, you know, we better get good ratings. So we went and bought a bottle of wine. We got some nice soap. You know, we tidied the place up.
Not the number one motel then?
Not the number one motel. And we got, you know, organic milk and bread and stuff. And then we went away. And the other thing you do, the first time you Airbnb your place out, is you Google the person, of course. So you go, you find their LinkedIn, you know, you have a look at where they've stayed. You make sure they're not, you know, perverts or something. And then you accept the booking, they come and stay. They were a couple from Adelaide, an older couple who were coming over for a wedding, so like, perfect. Anyway, came home, the bottle of wine was about $25, which was a lot for us back then. And we came home and about a glass was missing from the bottle. And I remember we were just cleaning up, and I pulled out the fridge, and I was like, I held up for my wife and go, do you reckon we can drink this still? And it was sort of like, this is what my mind does. I just remember thinking, why not? What's the worst that could happen? They're quite sophisticated types. They wouldn't have drunk from the bottle. Had they drunk from the bottle, what are the chances they're sick? You know? And so I'm doing all this calculus, and suddenly, you know, I thought, that's not the worst thing that could happen. Like, what if they've got the keys cut? And they're going to come back and kill us, you know? Or what if they've installed cameras all throughout the house and they're just watching us, you know? So
ladies
suddenly...
and gentlemen, welcome to the inside of the mind of a crime writer.
It's a miserable way to live, actually, just constantly catastrophizing. But that's sort of where it comes. I think when we talk about the psychological place, people think you must be really dark and stuff, but I think part of it's just being paranoid, frankly, you know?
So from a reader's perspective, and I use this hashtag a lot in social media, particularly when I'm reading New Zealand crime writers, your books are being described as unput-downable. It's a great word, which I can attest to. What's the secret? Is it what you reveal? Is it what you withhold?
Yeah,
or is
it's
it
not a real
else?
word though, is it? What's the secret?
You literally cannot put it down.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, I get it. I just don't think we should use it. No. So, I think the key. It's the same with film. I think it's the hook. But when you write, I've been talking to screenwriters, and I think prose is so unforgiving. I think so. Screenwriters, it's sort of like direction and voice is less important, although it is a factor. But with writing in fiction and prose, so much of it. Think of all the boring books you've read that were actually really good. When I say boring, like nothing happens, but you're captivated because the voice of the character is so strong, or you're taken by the beauty of the prose, the poetry, whatever. Think about how bad those would be as movies, and often lots of them have become movies, and they're bad movies, right? I think of like small things like these, which I don't know if anyone's seen that. It was a Claire Keegan novel that was awesome. It's really short, and the film was okay, pretty good. Cillian Murphy or something, is that his name? Who's the guy? Anyway, so that was about as good as a novella can be, but the movie was like okay, but so much of the interiority and stuff, you needed the best actor to demonstrate that. Whereas on the page, you can explore the interior world in much greater depth. And I think the challenge with making things gripping is, and to be unputdownable or whatever, is you have to have prose that's competent and clean and just frankly not bad. You just have to have prose that people can stay with. But at the same time, I think these days, you're not competing with other books. I always think of it that way. When I'm writing, I'm thinking I'm not competing with other books. I'm not even competing with film and TV. I'm competing with all these really, frankly, I think, intrusive attention economy algorithms that can capture someone in 2 seconds and hold them for an hour. How can I beat that? How can I actually compete with that? What do I need to do? And it's not about coming down to their level in terms of being sensationalists or anything like that. It's just about thinking constantly on every page, would the reader stop reading here? Have I given them an opportunity to leave the story? And I'd say the same thing when I watch. I don't watch a hell of a lot of TV, which is probably disappointing for everyone here. But I think it's the same thing with TV. I think that's what frustrates me of stuff that drops every week. I'll often watch the first one or two and then not come back, and that's because I've been given an opportunity to stop. And it's the same. I think that's what makes something gripping. Is as I write, I'm constantly interrogating each moment, each beat, and saying, is this an opportunity for the reader to leave the story?
So I've read that your wife is your first reader.
Not anymore.
Not
actually,
anymore?
Yeah.
You've stopped that? You don't let her anymore?
She's stopped that,
She's stopped
unfortunately.
that. Okay.
No, she wants the end product now, I think. She used to come into the room really early. But yeah, anyway, sorry.
Oh, it's all good. I was going to ask if she ever told you to get rid of a character and whether you did it or not.
It's funny because she comes in, this is why she comes in at basically the proofread stage now, is because she'd come in the first draft and she'd be almost doing line edits, and I'll go, no, you're structural at this stage. You just tell me what, does it work? So she is, her and her mother, who is also an early reader for me, they're both really valuable because everyone else who has input is either a writer or an editor, and so they're not the people I want reading my books. The people I want reading my books are the people who read 4 books a year on holiday, right? If you can capture them, you're going to get everyone else who reads a book a week or whatever. So I'm trying to target the people. Well, when I say target, it's never as calculated as that. I'm conscious of capturing the attention of the people who are not reading a lot of books, and so my wife and my mother-in-law are really valuable, I think, for that. Paige will come in sometimes and I'll tell her the idea of a story and she goes, oh, no, that would never happen. And I'm like, it's crime fiction. We have a little bit more room. And then she'll read it, and then if she says it after she reads it, that's when I'm take note. But if she says it before, it's about execution for me. Do I get away with it, is what I'm asking. And it's the same thing, I have a cop read something or talk to him about it, and I'm not saying, is this what happens? I'm saying, could this happen, right? Would you accept this? Would you suspend disbelief for this?
No, that's great. When you won the Ngaio Marsh for Call Me Evie in 2019, that was sort of a breakthrough. How did that change things practically in terms of agent interest and publishing deals?
Yeah,
and also your own confidence in your work?
I think honestly, it didn't change much. I think in terms of milestones, the game changers for me, actually, probably the film and TV stuff was much more of a sort of validating.
You're speaking to the right audience for that.
No. So it's the award stuff's kind of interesting because no one outside the industry cares or knows, and it's so. I say this as someone who's been shortlisted for any number of awards and haven't won many. It's just so subjective, and I don't want to invest too much of my emotional energy into that stuff. And even back then, I didn't think too much about it. I was probably more interested in. It seems like it was a breakthrough, but it probably wasn't in so much as it was just sort of validating a little bit for me. It's a bit of a confidence boost. I think the film and TV stuff's been much more significant, and it probably hasn't had as bigger effect on sales as I might have hoped for, but it certainly has helped with reputation. The front list sells better, definitely now. The back list still sells reasonably well, but now each book seems to have a bit of a boost, and there's more talk about it. And and also my options are a bit higher now, which is always great. So I think that stuff's been much more significant for me.
So in order to build that, are you under pressure, or do you choose to do social media, newsletters, podcasts, Substacking? Is there pressure on you to do more of that?
One time the head of marketing at Hachette flew down to take me out for lunch, and I go, well, this isn't a free lunch. Something's happening. And she sat me down and we're eating. She goes, Josh, do you know you've got events on your website for events in 2019? And I was like, oh, have I? And I sort of knew that. And so my author website hadn't been updated since like my second book. And so she sort of went through and was like, and also, you can actually schedule posts on Instagram, so you don't even you can just do them all for an hour for once a week, and then they'll just go out every day. And I was like, yeah, I do know that. But they're constantly telling me to do this stuff, and I think it's nonsense. But I think if you've got a following, it's easy to get published and easy to get an audience. But for me, my response always, it feels so unnatural to me. And I think if it means my books are 1% worse, I would rather make the book better. And I tell that, it's probably bad advice now, actually, but I always say that to writers. I'm like, if your book's going to be better by you not spending 2 hours a day on Instagram, talking to a camera to your 11 followers, write the better book. And I think that's changing, unfortunately. I think so many influencers are getting book deals and writing these crap books. And so maybe that's slightly changed. And I am feeling more and more pressure, definitely, to do the social stuff. And I think if I have something to say, I'll generally will put something on social media, but more often than not, I actually don't.
So there's something else I'm always interested about with authors and their work, is the ones who choose to narrate their own audiobooks and those who don't. You didn't. Was that intentional?
They wouldn't. There's no way they would let me. There's just no way they would. One, I have accents in there, so that's just never going to work. And two, I respect the competency of other creatives, right? I wouldn't write a kid's book. And so there are people who this is their work, this is their art, is their voice actors, and they're going to do a better job than me. I do have some friends who have done it, and I cringe because I think you're doing yourself a disservice, frankly. So yeah, I have no interest in that. Although I did have a cameo in one of my shows, and so I might be an actor now. Actually, might be a bit of a late pivot for me to act.
So let's go down the rabbit hole that we heard a little bit about yesterday. Then, if you obviously value the work of other creatives, artificial intelligence. Have you got a view?
I think there's so little money in publishing that I can't see why they would continue to invest in training these algorithms to write books more than, if you look at accounting makes sense, film and TV unfortunately makes sense, graphic design makes sense, because these all cost so much, but they also are so valuable. Whereas I think it's slowed right down in terms of the development of AI for poetry, prose, and writing, because it wouldn't be. I wouldn't imagine it's a really big target for these greedy kind of AI developers. I just can't. But in saying that, I'm not so naive to think it's not inevitable. I just think that the horizon for this stuff, in terms of writing novels and in terms of engagement, people don't want to read that stuff, right? So brand authors, if you found out James Patterson had written a book by AI, I think that would be even his career over. Honestly, I don't think people want it, and I think in New Zealand recently, 2 books were excluded from a prize for using AI on the cover. So even that, it's not. I wouldn't say it's the most egregious breach of consumer trust, but it's still something that people value so highly, is human-created stuff. And I had this thought that it's a little bit like. At first, I was doom and gloom, and I thought it's like how many people buy their shoes from cobblers now, right? Like you don't. It's something that sort of you seek out if that's what you really value, but you're happy for your shoe to be made in a factory or whatever. And I sort of thought that would be the case with books. I thought, well, if there'll be a small market and people will pay a premium to have a book written by a human or whatever. But I think actually the opposite is true. I think if you're publishing a book a day on Amazon, which some people are, you're in trouble because your books are crap, and AI can write crap books. But I think right now they can't write quality fiction, fortunately, and hopefully it'll be a while before it can.
Amen to that. Hopefully we've got that on record. I'm going to use that as a quote. IP. When did you first learn about managing your own rights?
I don't know anything about it. My agent is very, very good with the stuff. And, you write a book and everything outside of it being published feels like a cherry on top. And so I always viewed film and TV stuff, if it were to ever happen for me, it would help me sell more books. Now I see it as something separate and something really powerful. And I have a growing interest in being closer to these projects. I don't know if I'd be happy to be in the writer's room or something. I don't know if I would ever want to be much closer than that. But I always view adaptions as cousins, not siblings, So there's like a common ancestry, but they're not the same thing. They're a separate thing. And managing the IP, I think I just view it as we make more money and that gives me more time to write books. It's a really probably callous and cold way to look at it, but it's just true that it's really enabled me to focus on what I think I do best, which is write books. And my agents in Australia, my film agent in LA, they do all the stuff with the rights. I trust them completely to do the right thing by me, and they're constantly telling me, we've got this person or this person's interested. I have no idea. I just have to grin and be like, it's amazing. And I just don't know who any of these people are, what they do. But it is really, it's really its own thing. And it is still a cherry on top for me. It's still, additional income and a bit more exposure and that sort of thing.
It must have been fun the first time, though. When In the Clearing was picked up by Disney Plus, that must have been good to get that phone call.
I didn't, it's funny, they took me out to Wine Bar and the production company that had it, and they said, this is, I think her name's Deb from Disney Plus. And I go, hey, nice to meet you, Deb. And she goes, and it's this nice wine bar, she goes, go grab any wine you want out of the fridge. I go, okay. And so I was like, grabbed like a Chablis or something, and I came back and we're having a wine. And then Jude Law, who's the head of the production company, Jude Troy, said, she goes, Disney have agreed. I have taken on the option to produce The Clearing, and I was so idiotic and naive. I was like, oh, that's cool. It's really cool. And I didn't know what that meant. And so after this, we have this wine, and they're kind of like getting photos and stuff. And I'm like, oh, this is a bit weird. And I called my agent after, and I said, oh, I've had the weirdest meeting. What is this? And she goes, did they say green lit or green light or anything? I go, no, I don't think so. I don't know. And so, of course, she calls Jude straight away. And then she calls me back and goes, oh, they're making it. I'm like, what do you mean? Why didn't they say that?
Note to self, clarity when talking to authors if you want to do a deal.
I think the NDA should have probably clued me up a bit more. Before I had a sip of my nice Chardonnay, they just whip out an NDA for me to sign, which I hadn't done before. But it was like that the whole way through. You'd go, another time they took me out and they said, we've got Teresa Palmer and we've got Guy Pearce. And I was just going, and I was like, oh, so good, yeah, really good. And then I text my in-laws, I go, do you guys know Guy Pearce? I've Googled him, he's an Australian actor. And then they said, and because I'm just such an idiot, I didn't realise how big a deal it was, I just sort of thought about the money actually. I was like, this is really cool. But then I think when I went on set, I had like I had chills. You see a scene from the book that these really famous people were acting, and how many, just the industry of it. There's like 100 people, and again, as someone who hadn't been on a film set before or a TV set, I just recognise how competent everyone. It's just people come in, everyone's moving, everyone knows what they need to do. There's someone walking around with like 4 different duct tapes on his belt and some carabiners, and I'm like, geez, this is incredible. And I just remember thinking, this is from my little book, and that was surreal. And then when we went to the premiere, which was a bit of a big deal up in Sydney, I was just sitting I had a cameo on that actually, and we had to go get costumes. We got fitted out, and my daughter, I was like, oh, I want my family. And they're like, yeah, we can do that. So my daughter had to get and it's all set. The scene was set in the 70s. So they put all this stuff on us, do the makeup. We're out there all day. They had to get a form for my daughter to be on set, signed and all this stuff. Anyway, you go out there. We were there for like 6 hours or something. And they go, oh, there's 2 extras. This is their big break. They walk on, they go, you 2 to the back. And my heart just breaks. But they put us in where we're going to be seen. And anyway, at the premiere, me and my wife are watching, and the camera's panning, and we're leaning, like, here we go, and then just cuts to the next scene, and we just looked at each other like, what the fuck, But I remember this first scene, I was just weeping, and that was because, that was much more significant, I think, than the Last Guest stuff, because it was the first one, and it was big and loud and exciting, and
So you haven't been involved in any of the scripts so far?
No, they send them to me and I just mark as read because I wanted to watch them fresh, and also I'm a busy guy. So I've consulted. They come in and they point out all the plot holes and say, what were you thinking? I don't know. I wrote this book 5 years ago. But yeah, I've got a growing interest, certainly in screenwriting a little bit, but I don't know if I want to be that close to it. And also, it's that thing. These people are experts. Like, screenwriting is a separate thing and separate expertise. And I have enough friends who are screenwriters to acknowledge that they've all had authors who have tried to interfere or who've taken it personally when you've made wholesale changes or whatever to their work. And I don't really want to be that person. And I think there's a chance I would become that person if I'm reading these scripts and having my own input.
So 17 years later is now with Made Up Stories, the production company behind Big Little Lies, The Last Thing He Told Me, and Anatomy of a Scandal. That's pretty elite company.
Yeah.
Does this deal different from the others?
There's more money. So that was good. That was exciting. Yeah, no, she's a real force, Bruna. We went out for lunch and I was blown away by how normal she was, actually. She's a really lovely woman and really friendly. My experience in general with people who are closer to the Hollywood side of the industry is they're pretty. They tell you about all their credits and stuff, and they really. It feels like they've got a point to prove. Which there was nothing like that with her. She was really lovely. It is a bigger. It's a bigger deal. Definitely, people seem to be more excited about this than the other stuff, and it's moving quickly with them. It feels like she's just pulling people in really quickly, whereas I feel like the other ones, it was slower and they were pitching themselves much harder, I feel like, whereas Bruna's sort of just kind of feels like she's going along and yeah, it just feels like a different kind of thing with her.
So it seems like the books are getting picked up sooner. Does that mean that the one that's due out in February has already been picked up?
Well, it's funny because it's a sequel, so it's with the company that has the first one, and that's showing a bit of promise, and they're pretty excited about that. So I think it's with them, and it's annoying because it's new IP is I see now as really valuable for this stuff, whereas I've never written a returning character. This is the first time. And I don't know, I just always say I never want the film stuff to influence my actual approach to writing and what I choose to write about and so on and so forth. But it's really hard to ignore the fact that even just the option fees is another thing for me, to keep me going. And the potential, just having IP that's in development or with companies that are out there trying to get it made, that's really exciting. And I don't think that happens with sequels because someone's already got the original, they've got the character in that original story. So yeah, it's not, we haven't had that conversation, but my agent said it will likely go to the same company that has the first one.
So that taking original IP or keeping the IP and then finding new homes and things for it, do you think there's a growing appetite for perspectives from this side end of the world to global audiences?
Yeah, I mean that feels to me like that's the case. My observation as someone who's, again, I'm really outside this industry and I don't watch enough TV to really have my finger on the pulse for that sort of stuff, but I feel like I'm seeing a lot more Australian content and a lot more Australian and New Zealand books being adapted for international audiences. I don't know what it was like in the past, but I assume there was a time where New Zealand books would be adapted for New Zealand audiences by New Zealand companies, whereas now it feels like New Zealand books can be adapted by Australian or Irish or whatever international companies for international audiences. That feels like an interesting kind of shift, and hopefully it's a trend that continues. I know holding the streamers accountable and stuff like that, again, have no real expertise in any of this stuff, but again, as my observation's been in Australia, forcing them to make more local content has been a really good thing for the local industry, and we're seeing a lot of books being picked up and adapted.
Yeah, I think that as somebody who has a role in the wider creative ecosystem, wearing the branding today we create, for those of you who haven't heard of us, government relations for the entire industry, everything from architecture to fashion to publishing, music and everything in between. Looking from that perspective, looking to the different parts of the ecosystem to see where original IP sits that might translate into other formats is something that we look at all the time. But just bringing it back to you, Josh, and we'll wind up and ask for some questions from the floor. Has this success changed what you're willing to write? Does the writing still come from you rather than outside influences?
I mean, just going back to that thing, with the stuff with sequels and writing returning characters, putting that aside, I think I have always tried to write in a cinematic way. So that the fact that it's happened without me thinking too much about it twice now, and possibly for a third time, means I have to remind myself, don't think about it, because you didn't think about it before and it worked, But in saying that, I think I'm more conscious of pitchable content, if that makes sense. And I'm more conscious, and this is just because I think these books also work, but I know there are some people whose agents, there's like a guy in the States who's got a few people in Australia, and I'm friends with one of them, and he's telling them what to write, and he's trying to pitch movie deals before they get book deals, which I think is just so backwards. You can't think that way, because as I'm beginning to realise, film stuff's so much harder and so much more unpredictable than books. I don't write a book at the moment unless someone's already paid me to write it, right? And it's definitely going to get published. Whereas with the film stuff, even if someone options it, even if a star's attached and you've got a director and writer, you can get all the way to the finish line and it still doesn't happen. So I think thinking about it and writing for that is it's never going to work for you. And I have the friend who has this agent who said, "Oh, you got to write this," and she wrote it, and the book wasn't very good, and it didn't sell very well, and the film stuff hasn't happened.
So constraining creative freedom doesn't work.
No, but like if you tell a kid to draw something, they're paralysed by everything they can draw. But if you say draw something red, they'll draw an apple or a fire truck. So I believe that putting some constraint but it has to be your choice. So if I say I want to write something that's set across one day, that's me. That's not a high concept. I'm not thinking, oh, this could be a film. That's me entertaining myself and writing with it, within this kind of forced constraint. Whereas if someone says, oh, you got to write a story about a kid who gets kidnapped on a train and dad's, and if someone tells me what to write, the book's going to be crap because I'm not going to surprise myself in the writing process, right? I'm not going to be seduced by the potential of the story because it already feels like it's already happened in my head. I'm not exploring and I'm not learning as I write. I've been told what to write, and so it's. I think just with because I constantly get asked how did you get this? How have you had a couple of things made? And I think it's the most important thing is actually the simplest thing, and that's just to write the best book you can. I think there's an appetite for crime fiction. It's an evergreen kind of thing for film and TV as well as books. So I think that does help. But frankly, just writing the best book you can is so much more important than trying to predict what the film market's doing, let alone the book market. It seems insane to me that people actually think that that's a good way to go about it. And it may have worked for someone. I don't know anyone it has worked for that said, I've got another friend, Candice Fox, who only writes standalones because she believes it gives them more opportunity to be made into film and TV. And all her fans are just begging, and her sales have come down a little bit, and her fans are begging for follow-ups to her earlier work, and she won't do it because the film and TV stuff is so attractive and so lucrative for her that she'd rather do that. And I just think that's why don't you become a screenwriter? Why are you writing novels at all?
Yeah, so that takes us back to the authentic conversation we were having in the first panel this morning. Thank you, Josh. Opening the floor. Questions from anybody? Obviously to Josh, not to me.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm curious about your process. You talk about at the beginning it was a lot of short stories, honing your craft, sending those out. Now you're doing a book a year. How do you maintain that, and how did you work up to that level of pace?
Yeah, it's probably, I think it's actually averages out a book every sort of 18 months, but I've written a couple of novellas for Audible, which were subsequently printed. My publisher just, in off years where I didn't want to write a book, they published them. I think it, from the outside, it does look really hyper-productive, but there's two things. One, when your first book gets published, certainly for me it was about 2 years between when I got my book contract to when it came out. And so you've got this big run-up, and I'd heard about second book syndrome or sophomore syndrome, whatever, where the second book's really hard to write because you're so concerned with how the first book's going, and and you're reading reviews, and it's kind of contaminated your process. So I actually wrote my second book a long time before my first came out, which gave me this kind of momentum, I think. But nowadays, something that has slowed me down as a kid, it's really annoying to be a dad all the time.
You're not allowed to say that.
She's amazing. But that did slow me down for a bit. I think the thing is not waiting. And film people are really good at this. They just sort of hustle. And authors are like, so melancholy sometimes, and like waiting for something to happen. But one thing that actually having a kid has helped me with this is I used to really take it for granted how I had this time. I quit my jobs as soon as I got my first book deal, and having these days were just as open and vast as the sea, and I could just explore, and if something went wrong I could go back. Whereas now I think having a kid, I'm like, cool, I've got an hour, I'm going to write for every minute of it, right? So I think I've trained that muscle a little bit. I can write on planes. I used to be really self-conscious about the person next to me reading my screen. Now I just don't care. But I can write. I can go to the pub, have a beer or two, and then go home and write. Right, and I can write when I'm touring and doing events. And I never used to be able to do that. And I think part of it is recognising it as a real privilege to be writing full-time and to be in a creative industry, which is in a world that's been pretty hostile, I think, to creative industries the last sort of little while. So I think it's just something that I've built up as a muscle, and just recognising that if I view it as a job, I'm still working less, I feel like, than most people. I'm probably writing for 3 or 4 hours a day. I'd much rather be doing that than digging a ditch or something, right? So I just have to kind of get in that mindset that it is work as well. I think just pick someone.
I pick myself. Have you recognised the creative talent in your daughter yet?
Yeah, honestly, she's an amazing swimmer. I know it's not creative. I'm really, like, her mum was a competitive swimmer and her grandma was a competitive swimmer, so it feels inevitable. She loves swimming. I think that's her thing. But she also loves drawing, and who knows what sort of market there will be for that in 15 years or whatever. But yeah, I do see it. It's kind of inspiring, actually, the freedom with which kids can create. Yeah, and like the best thing that's happened to me since I started writing book is having her, actually. But also, I've toured with her a bit, and I'll be telling the worst anecdote in the world, and she's just sitting in the row, like with all the old women who go to literary events, and she's just like watching this little 5-year-old. And it's incredible. Like, that just makes me happy when I'm talking. So yeah, she's a good little kind of pseudo publicist to take on the road.
You don't want to narrow their creative fields when they're 5. Like, you don't want to narrow their sports either. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to join me in thanking JP for his time this morning.
Thank you.
And for those of you who haven't been on your phones and done it already, The Gambler is out in all good bookshops in February 2026. And as I said, mine's already pre-ordered. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Magnificent filling in there at the last moment. And thank you, JP. Really inspiring, actually, to see a kind of classic example of a successful Kiwi artist, and that you work so hard on your craft and have that strong work ethic, but also just vibes. Just vibes, bro. Love it. For those of you who are wondering, the #1 motel in Cambridge costs $150 a night. And get excited, they've got a conference room. So, Spada 2026, here we come.